man and horse. The romantic image is as much alive today as it was more than 4,000 years ago when, together, they set out to conquer the world. More recently, the romance of the horse has been fully exploited in films, excerpts of which are used in these programs to support the fact that without the horse, the story of man would have developed in a very different way. The origins of the horse can be traced back to that moment, some 55 million years ago, when a small furry animal about the size of a dog fox first appeared in the landmass that we now call North America. This small forest dweller, the dawn horse, or Eohippus, is not readily recognizable as the original ancestor of the modern horse, although there are similarities in the ankle and head structure. After some 30 million years, successive waves of less primitive North American horses spread out across the land bridges which then existed between North America and Asia, adapting continuously to their changing environment. As climatic conditions grew cooler, forests began to give way in many areas to more open countryside. It was during this period that the Alps and Himalayas were created, that the Mediterranean Sea became virtually landlocked, and, most significant to the future of man and horse, Europe and Asia became joined together as one landmass. As primeval forests gave way to more open countryside, the early horses developed into larger, stronger creatures. Myohippus at 30 million years, which in turn developed into Pliohippus.
Pliohippus developed from pre-existing Myohippus, probably here on the grasslands in North America, turning up about 35 to 40 million years ago. They differ from the modern horses, mostly in a matter of size, relative size of the head. The number of toes, modern horses have a single toe on each foot, while Pliohippus and its ancestors had 3.
In the course of this evolution, Pliohippus had developed the ability to move swiftly away from predators. He'd also developed a great heightening of the senses to all that was going on around him. This sensitivity was to develop gradually into the highly strung character of the modern thoroughbred. After the last ice age, 4 groups of equus had survived. The zebra in Central and Southern Africa, wild asses, including the onagers, who lived in most parts of Asia and in East Africa, the Przewalski wild horse in Eastern Asia, and the tarpan, which had spread across Asia and into Europe.
The tarpan, which had an enormous range from the steppes of Asia across into northern Europe, through the forests and the marshes, was the predominant horse that became the ancestor of all our domestic animals.
From the tarpan, 2 distinctive types of horse developed. On the eastern plateau, the lighter, smaller type of horse, which would develop into the steppes pony and ultimately the Arabian. And in northwestern Europe, a heavier, coarser type of forest horse. Distant relatives of the horse include hippos, hippopotamus means river horse, rhinos, and tapir. The tapir still has the 3-toed feet of the eohippus. Describing the modern horse, the term hot-blooded refers to the Arab or the thoroughbred, which are descended from the tarpan or the Przewalski, while the term cold-blooded refers to horses like the Shire or the Clydesdale, which are descended from the cold-blooded forest horses.
All over northwest Europe, they would seem to go back to the Solutrean horse, the Magdalenian horse of 20,000 years ago, and no doubt, as they spread and followed the retreating ice sheets north, they came into various kinds of countryside and developed largely because of their environment, with a much heavier frame, bigger hooves certainly, softer hooves some of them, and also a much more placid and docile temperament. But with so many things to do with horses, you pay your money and you take your choice. The hot-blooded desert horses, the ones that came from the Arab, the Barb, the North African horses, they all tend to have small, hard, flinty hooves and much finer bones, and certainly a fiery temperament.
Although not acceptable to scientists, horsemen today use the term hot-blooded to describe horses descended from those bred in the East, and cold-blooded to describe horses descended from the heavier type of horse.
When you cross a hot-blooded horse with a cold-blooded horse, you produce what we would term the half-bred. If, however, you pull in a bit more of the hot-blooded, a little bit less of the cold-blooded, you have a 3/4 bred horse, or what really is a middleweight hunter. It seems remarkable that over some 2,000 years, the original descendants of the tarpan, which has since become extinct, although there's plenty of argument about that, should have developed into so many diverse types and breeds.
Before this could happen, however, in addition to the 2 natural forces of the environment and natural selection, which governs the evolution of all wild creatures, an extra ingredient was needed: man. Emerging in the latter stages of the last ice age, primitive man's first relationship with the horse was that of hunter and hunted. The importance of the horse as a beast of prey is well recorded in these cave drawings, painted some 15,000 years ago at Lascaux in France and Santander in Spain. Like the Lapps today, prehistoric peoples depended on hunting for their survival. Having no control over the wanderings of their quarry, they had to follow the annual migrations of wild animals. It was as a hunting partner that man first domesticated the dog, later using teams of dogs to increase their mobility.
The interesting thing about the domestication of the dog, and the reason, I believe, why he was the first of the animals to be domesticated by man, is because he is so similar to us. He's an aggressor, he's a meat eater, he's a hunter. And so what more natural that he should be made the auxiliary in man's hunting forest?
But since civilization can never grow up on the move, man gradually sought to dominate his environment. In fertile areas like the river valleys of the Tigris and the Euphrates, nomadic peoples began to put down roots. By growing their own crops, they were now able to create some control over their lives, so that survival was no longer totally dependent upon a constant search for food. Later, by domesticating certain wild animals, initially goats, then sheep and cattle, people in these fertile areas were able to further decrease their absolute dependence upon the forces of nature. We believe that the horse was first domesticated on these steppe lands some 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. The very nature of the horse, however, made him much harder to tame than many other animals, which may partly explain why he was not domesticated until some thousands of years later than sheep or cattle. Once domesticated, the horse became the most valued possession of the nomadic peoples, providing their meat, milk from the mares, hides for clothing, and even dung to fuel their fires.
The next logical step was to use its power. Until that moment, man had been a beast of burden, dragging great heavy, unwieldy sledges such as this one. What could be more natural than to harness the horse to the sledge, or use it as a pack animal?
Probably the next logical move, rather than plodding along beside him, was to get on him. And who knows which way they got on him first? Presumably they faced the right direction. But they possibly just sat here. And then when they wanted to go a bit quicker, they found that they didn't stay there. So maybe they went astride, which I certainly find a great deal more comfortable and a lot safer.
Freed from the sledge, man was able to overcome his own limitations in terms of distance. He could now literally bestride the world. Over the next millennium, the domesticated horse spread into Western Europe, the Caucasus, and on into Arabia, and eastwards into China. For the next 4,000 years, the horse remained, unchallenged, as the swiftest and most efficient form of land transport.
Days of horsemanship, it was necessary for man to establish some form of control over an animal whose strength was far greater than his own. The first form of control that would have been practiced by the early domesticators of the horse would have been as simple as a piece of woven rope or a leather thong. And the first means of restraint is to get the piece of rope round the horse's neck. Now you have a certain degree of control, not very much, but you can increase it by slipping a noose over the pony's nose and making a simple halter like that, which gives you a great deal more control. You can, in fact, ride in that quite easily. And if you want just a little more again, you can pass a thong through the pony's mouth there, over the lower jaw. Now you've got quite a lot of control. And from there, it's very easy to make the transition to a bit made of bone or horn, such as we have found in Mesopotamia in about 2,300, 2,500 BC. We've got control. So now we need a little more comfort. So we use a skin, and that can be secured by the first type of girth that was ever used, a piece of rope. And after that, we can make the rider more secure by putting pads on the back and the front of the saddle, so that he can remain in place that much more easily.
Over the next 1,500 years, the mounted herdsman was able to increase the size of his flocks and herds, and as a result was constantly on the move, seeking bigger and better pastures. For moving and maintaining his stock, the nomad was totally dependent upon the horse. As the importance of the horse increased, his size and strength became a significant factor. So, to improve the quality of his herds, as they mingled freely on the open steppes, nomadic horsemen created the first form of selective breeding by castrating or often eating all but the largest and strongest stallions. In the land of its origins, however, the species Equus had died out.
Some 8,000 years ago, there occurred one of the world's great unsolved mysteries. The horse became extinct on the American continent, which had been the very cradle of the equine race. And we don't know the reason why. The result, however, was for the people of America to become isolated in small groups, bereft as they were of the mobility that the horse would have provided, or of the sort of mobility that could have been supplied by some other alternative.
Elsewhere, alternatives did exist. The camel, with its ability to travel long distances without food and water, has great advantages in desert regions. But his shape makes the camel difficult to ride and awkward too for carrying loads. In South America, the llama and the alpaca are used, but have a very limited carrying power. Not short of power is the elephant, but the difficulty of maintaining elephants in colder climates limits their usefulness. The reindeer can be used in northern climates where suitable food is plentiful. The slowness of the yak is offset in mountainous regions by his agility, but elsewhere it's not a serious contender. The ox, in many regions, is preferred to the horse for draft work, causing the horse, according to ancient Mesopotamian legend, to boast, "I live near to kings and great men. I eat delicately, without myself being eaten." But for riding and for speed, oxen cannot compare with the horse. What should be able to is the zebra. But the zebra is temperamentally difficult to manage, though the late Lord Rothschild once shocked London society by driving a team to Buckingham Palace.
With the help of the horse, the efficiency of the nomadic herdsman improved. An ever-increasing surplus of stock was created, and with it an ever-increasing nomadic population. And herdsmen were forced to become mounted warriors, because the horse, which helped to create the surplus, also enabled the mounted nomad to steal it.
There's a saying that a pure nomad is a poor nomad. For wandering herdsmen are always dependent upon settled communities for salt and iron and indeed luxury goods as well. The deep-rooted conflict of interests developed some 2,500 years ago and led to constant confrontation, which has continued to the present day. This conflict becomes acute in those marginal zones which can support either nomadic pastoralism or agriculture, but not both.
One of the classic examples of this can be found along the northwestern and northern frontier of China. It was in this area, in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, that you had a distinction emerge between the Chinese farmer and his nomad neighbor. The conflict between these two ways of life was to dominate Chinese history through the next 2,000 years.
Nomadic warriors were already spearheading what was to become an oft-repeated armed migration from the southern Asiatic steppes in the Ukraine. Asian ponies were still too small to carry armed warriors into battle, but they were the means by which these warriors could travel great distances. While the Kassites and Elamites conquered northwest Persia, the Hyksos rode their tough little ponies into Asia Minor. The invention of the wheel increased their mobility and allowed them to move families and possessions as well. A sophisticated version of a steppe carriage, itself over 3,000 years old, can be seen at the Hermitage Museum in Leningrad.
This chariot has survived intact. It is constructed entirely out of wood and has these enormous wheels, which approach the height of a man and contain a large number of spokes. Under the canopy, it would have been like a house on wheels. This magnificent chariot was pulled over the steppes of the Altai by 4 steppe horses, small horses, descendants of Przewalski's horse. Moreover, if we pay attention to the harnesses of riding horses, it is clearly a magnificent piece of work and beautifully crafted. It is a perfect example of the art of the Scythians of the High Altai.
It was the adaptation of these carts into engines of war which raised the horse to a special and permanent place in his relationship with mankind. Using war chariots for the first time, the Hyksos broke out of Asia Minor, spreading through the Near East and into Egypt to create the Hittite Empire. In their defeat of the Egyptians at the Battle of Kadesh in 1288 BC, the victorious Hittite army consisted of 17,000 foot soldiers and 3,500 chariots.
The introduction of the chariot revolutionized society both east and west. It introduced the wheel into Egypt for the first time, and with it greatly increased mobility between the various civilizations of the Near and Middle East. Now, originally, the war chariot would have held a driver and a bowman, and would have been drawn by 2 horses similar to these Irish-bred ponies, but of course they were considerably smaller. But the need for larger, faster chariots with more and more firepower also produced the need for more and more horsepower.
And this became all the more important because the major problem with this early type of harness was that the traction was all on this one strap here, round under the neck, round the windpipe. And the problem was that the harder the horse pulled, the more difficult he found it to breathe.
Originally, the martial empires of the Hittites and Babylonians, Assyrians and Egyptians increased their chariots' horsepower by increasing the number of horses drawing each chariot. By the 14th century BC, the need for larger, better quality horses rather than simply more and more of them had become apparent. This led to selective breeding, a process which has continued up to the present. The search for the perfect horse is as much alive today as it's ever been.
It seems that man's interest in the horse as a medical problem has related a great deal to the ebb and flow of civilization. The earliest records of which we have good documentation are the race or culture that lived at the southern end of the Caspian Sea, known as the Hittites, who had an entirely racing culture. It was the basis of their entire civilization. They were very interested in the horse's health, as has been the case wherever the horse's performance has been a part of man's interest. And the interest of the horseman in the horse's health problems has then paralleled the Persian civilization, the Greek civilization. But basically, each horseman was his own doctor. Each stable had an expert. Each cavalry troop had a sergeant who was the medical expert for that group. And it wasn't until much more recently that medicine as a distinct discipline in horses has been separated from the role of the groom and caretaker and feeder.
The Chinese Empire, where horses and chariots had been used from the 15th century BC during the Shang dynasty, was centered upon the North China Plain, which was particularly suitable for wheeled vehicles. Nevertheless, the usefulness of the chariot was seen by the Shang to be symbolic rather than strategic, as the evidence of power rather than the means to maintain it. When the Zhou warriors from the northern perimeter states replaced the Shang in 1100 BC, they came as great horsemen, and it was their cavalry which played the more important role in the decisive battles. The horse, however, played a major role in Chinese social order as the symbol of wealth and power. Roads were built to a standard width, as were the axles of all chariots and carts. In this way, only the carriages and carts of the elite could travel along government roads. Reflecting this elevation in their social status, horses remained an integral part of Chinese sacrificial and burial rites, being entombed with their illustrious masters to serve them in the next world as they had in this. The Chinese expanded their agricultural way of life steadily southwards into more fertile farmlands. Left the marginal grasslands to the north and west as the territory of nomadic herdsmen, hunters and warriors. As these mounted warriors formed themselves into larger and increasingly powerful groups, they were able to threaten their sedentary Chinese neighbors with ever more effective and daring armed raids. The decline of the Zhou dynasty in the 8th century BC led to a period of constant civil war, so that there was no central power able to combat effectively the growing power of these nomadic warriors. This warring states period lasted until 221 BC, when China was at last reunified by the Qin warriors who'd originated in the northwest. China had cavalry horses from the Warring States period. During the Qin dynasty, this was developed further, during which time there were many cavalry. There were about 1,000 war chariots, millions of cavalry horses and infantry in the Qin dynasty. They were extremely effective in battle, and invariably the enemy fell like flies. Parts of the Great Wall had already been constructed by the various states before the Qin dynasty. During his reign, the Emperor of Qin joined them together, giving it a total length of 3,000 miles. The Great Wall was less an impenetrable defensive barrier than a means by which the movement of people between two distinct cultural zones, that of the herdsman and that of the farmer, could be controlled. Its function was formally recognized by the Emperor Wan, who wrote in 162 BC to the Shan Yu, the leader of one of the most powerful nomadic confederations, "According to the established system, to the north of the Great Wall, the nations which draw the bow shall live under the rule of the Shan Yu. Within the Great Wall, I have mastery. I command my people to till and weave. You command your people to hunt wild beasts for food and clothing."
In 221 BC, China was unified by the Kingdom of Qin. Qin was located to the northwest, and it was in close contact with nomadic peoples. It also had a capacity to absorb those peoples into its own population. Horses played an important part in its conquest of China and in the establishment of the unified empire. Although it placed great store on its cavalry, it certainly wasn't an empire that was ruled from horseback. The Qin's success lay, in part, in its ability to organize, to apply strict rules, and to unify practices throughout the empire. For example, the writing system was unified, weights and measures were unified, axle widths were standardized. And in this way, it brought together the various divergent strands that had existed within what we now call China, and molded them into a single empire. And this legacy was to last for more than 2,000 years.
In the West, perhaps because of his more significant role in war, the horse was now seen as a partner of the gods rather than a sacrifice to them, a fact which was to be well recorded by the Greeks. Pegasus is seen here with Perseus and Andromeda. Having cut off Medusa's head, Perseus allowed her blood to fall upon the earth, and from it sprang Pegasus. As the partner of Bellerophon, Pegasus was to carry him into the heavens to slay Chimera. And these celestial horses, drawing the sun god Helios across those same heavens, appear far removed from earthly problems. Epona, the Celtic goddess of horses, the Huns were to see as their god of war. Poseidon, or Neptune, was, it appears, equally dependent upon them to command the oceans. Arabian folklore tells us, "Know then that amongst us it is accepted that God created the horse from the wind, as he created Adam from clay." Historian El-Kelbi, writing in 786 AD, was to trace the pedigrees of Arabians back nearly 5,000 years to the time of Baz, the great-great-grandson of Noah. More certain, perhaps, thrift-tapes is the fact that when Ishmael was banished into the wilderness, he needed the hardiness and speed of the desert-bred horses of the Yemen to carve out a place for himself in the world which had rejected him. In the days of Ishmael, southern Arabia was greener and more fertile than it is today. The warm, dry climate produced ideal conditions for the horse to evolve into a supremely refined animal whose courageous and fiery temperament combined stamina and endurance with great soundness of wind and limb. From this most refined and speedy descendant of the wild horse evolved the single most important natural factor in the ascent of the domestic horse, the arrow.
The Arabs knew the horse rather late in history, but a little fable tells the connection between horse and hunting in Arabia. It says that the in-laws of King Solomon went from the Arabian Peninsula into Jerusalem to greet him upon his appointment as king. And he gave them a horse. It was a new animal they never heard of. And he said, put a light rider on its back and it will help you all the way along. To their astonishment, this animal could make them reach any prey on the way and hunt it down and eat it. And they reached their families happy and not finding any hardships on the way. And they called that horse Zad al-Rakib, meaning provisions of the traveler. And all the horses in Arabia, the fable says, were the descendants of this Zad al-Rakib horse, which was given to them by King Solomon.
While the Arabian horse was developing in the Yemen, in northwestern Iran, a larger, more powerful type of horse, the Nicaean, was being selectively bred and selectively fed. This horse was to become the dominant factor in the struggle for power between the great Near Eastern civilizations.
The Nicaean was an amalgam of the bloods of the indigenous Persian horses, which were crossed with wild primitive stock, probably of the Mongolian wild horse. And it seems likely that from this, the jigsaw pattern works together, and we find coming out of that part of the world the Turkmen, the racing horse of that particular part, and probably also that marvelous golden horse, the Akal Tiki, who has tremendous stamina and is able to undergo the most tremendous privations. These were the horses of Nicaea, and this was what they were really all about, I think.
Possession of the cool climate and rich pastures of the region in which these horses were bred became of major military importance, for it was the Nicaean horse which created the superiority of the Assyrian, Babylonian, and ultimately the Persian war chariots over all others. Centuries later, the Greek poet Oppian wrote, "The horses of Nicaea are the handsomest, fit only for mighty rulers. They're splendid, running swiftly under the rider, obeying their bridles willingly." But now, the ascendancy of the war chariot began to be challenged. Mounted nomads from the southern steppes once again began moving westwards in search of fresh pastures.
Magnificent horsemen, they'd ride into battle without using their reins, therefore freeing both hands to fire clouds of arrows at their enemies. The Parthians, for example, having ridden against their enemies, would turn and wheel, and galloping away, would fire a Parthian shot over the horse's quarters before moving out of range.
By the 7th century BC, the mounted archer, swordsman, and spear thrower had become as important to the militaristic empires of Western civilization as the chariot. A constant interchange of attitudes and ideas followed the changing fortunes of war. Since trade followed in the wake of victorious armies, it was along the great trade routes of the Near East that a continuous cross-fertilization of differing cultures flourished and developed. It was as great trading centers that cities like Petra grew up and prospered. Entirely dependent upon its geographical position, the architecture of this capital of the Nabatean Empire reflects the differing cultures which, over the centuries, followed the ebb and flow of trade and war. The wealth of the Nabateans was based upon the incense and spice trade, which they were able to develop free from the warring armies of Egypt and Persia. As the basis for modern Arabic script, their language has survived the test of time, but their independence came to an end with the annexation of their lands by the Roman Emperor Trajan in 106 AD. As the center of power moved westwards and the trade routes developed further to the north, Petra ceased to be of importance and for centuries languished, its existence unknown except to passing Bedouin herdsmen. As the symbol of wealth and power, the horse was looked upon as being above any menial work in the autocratic and militaristic empires of the pre-Christian era. For the transport of goods, camels or donkeys were generally preferred, while oxen, mules, and onagers were used for heavier work.
Years before the birth of Christ, King Solomon's stables boasted 40,000 chariot and cavalry horses, but it was swiftly becoming clear that the size and quality of the horse was more important than the numbers. Since the best war horses were bred in northwestern Persia, control of that area became of immense strategic importance. Having once got that control, Persian cavalry and chariots were able to dominate Western civilization. These larger, stronger horses, when well fed on corn or barley, needed much more powerful methods of control, especially since the rider didn't have the benefit of a proper saddle or stirrups.
In order to obtain control, the Persians developed these much harsher bits. The Egyptians already had a form of drop nose band 1,000 years earlier. This pressure on the nose, in conjunction with pressure under the chin from cheek pieces of the bit that, interestingly enough, acted rather like a curb chain, along with the pressure through the mouth from the bit, meant they had 3 ways of gaining control.
Throughout their vast empire, the Persians created a mounted postal system which involved setting up hundreds of staging posts and the use of thousands of horses. Without the horse, it's hard to see how the Persian Empire could have maintained its strong, centralized control. For then, as now, control of the means of communication was the basis upon which the maintenance of power depended. The appreciation of the importance of this form of postal system led to the Roman, Mongol, and other empires following suit. And indeed, the last century saw the setting up of the Pony Express in the United States of America. In the West, the arrival of the horse and chariot, and later the mounted warrior, had revitalized the existing societies and opened up their horizons. By the 3rd century BC, the Persian Empire stretched from Egypt to Asia Minor and from India through to the Greek islands. Of the armies of Cyrus the Great, Herodotus wrote, "The armored Persian horsemen and their death-dealing chariots were invincible. No man dared face them." For the victims of these successive waves of invaders, the arrival of the horse must have seemed something of a mixed blessing. However, in terms of mankind, it was only in those areas where the domesticated horse made its appearance that any significant cultural or physical advance took place. In the centuries ahead, the ideas and cultures which were now developing were to have a profound influence on the Western world.
How horses made riders feel like gods on the next chapter in just a few minutes this Sunday evening, in about 10 minutes or so, around about 9 o'clock, to be followed by a new premiere on Masterpiece Theatre of Sorrel and Son, the story of a father and son in England in 1925, tonight at 10. And after this evening, Horses will continue Sunday nights at 9 o'clock for the next 4 weeks. And again, in about 10 minutes, the next chapter of Horses.